I think the first thing I want to say is that going through this guide, I really do welcome it, because I think it has many very useful, interesting observations and findings. It's a very, very impressive piece of work. What I think is particularly useful about it is the emphasis on relationships and how to negotiate them between academics and between operational people. I also think it provides a framework for the whole process. It's not just what, but also it's about the how. And I think that gives us a very interesting sort of lead-in. My comments today will come very much from an operational and policy perspective, which is very much my background, even though I have a little bit of a foot in another camp. What I wanted to do very, very quickly is just give 3 quick snapshots and country-specific illustrations of where I encountered the gaps that this guide could begin assist in filling. And I'm looking at 3 particular scenarios which are quite different but also have certain similarities, which is Nepal, Haiti and DRC, which are all places that I know a little bit. Very much personal observations, but trying to make them relevant to this guide. But first of all, some kind of broad-based observations. First of all, I think it's very much, what we're talking about is the nature of evidence. What is good enough data or evidence, and for whom? The second one is that something that I've encountered a lot, and I'd like to illustrate with my Nepal example, is that you tend to, when you're working in the field, in a sort of humanitarian environment, a lot of anecdotal data that's accumulated sometimes over a decade or more, and suddenly becomes the basis of a policy or country strategy for many people. It's a kind of slightly empty Russian doll scenario. The third issue is the difficulty that certainly that I've encountered and many of my colleagues in the field is of collecting information and triangulating it in conflict situations. And I think that presents a real challenge for all of us. But what is also important to me is how partnerships in one area link up with partnerships in another. You've got to tie in the different partnerships. And from my point of view, at least, I feel there are 2 things you can't get away from. One is politics. I think a lot of what we do is extremely political, and I think there's a reality check we need to take. And the second one is anthropology. We've got to understand more about the anthropology of the communities that we're working with. So I'm just using that as a sort of basic guide to what I'm about to say. But I think this guide creates a very high bar and a high onus on all of us to deliver. I've just come back a couple of weeks ago from Nepal, and I was looking there into the rehabilitation of former Maoist combatants who'd been involved in the fighting there for some years, who'd opted to go back into communities. And what I was essentially doing, and the guide refers to this, I was doing a kind of scoping and an analysis of the potential risks and to explore some possible avenues for a major agency, and looked at how they could move forward with the former Maoist combatants. My overall conclusion was very much that it demanded a political approach, but we had completely insufficient baseline data. Surprisingly, but maybe not unusual, is after decades of development efforts in Nepal, there's a mountain of anecdotal evidence. There are certain silos of thematic and district-specific data. There are also mountains of assessments and evaluations. Some of them have a very strong, solid local base. They've all been developed by different donors and agencies. They now cumulatively add up to the basis for policy development, and they become facts in a way. So it leads to quite a complicated policy landscape. And really the key point here I'm trying to make is that there's a tendency for silos and for research to be conducted in isolation, and there's really an important need to straddle linking partnerships with partnerships. Because essentially, in Nepal, what I found, it's actually quite obvious what needs to be done. You need a proper socioeconomic profiling of combatants. You need a proper labor market analysis. You need to look at the human security element and conduct a sort of longitudinal survey. All of this would feed into the operational effectiveness of agencies. Another aspect that is closely linked to my mind to the how you do this and the relationship between agencies and research institutions is the application. This is an old chestnut, I know, but it's the application of the principles of do no harm. And this has been carried on by different agencies in different ways over time, and I think there's some quite good examples. But I'm quite keen on this because it's helped me enormously when I looked at issues to do with community engagement and also in the absence of actually proper research data on the ground. I spent 18 months in Haiti, and by the way, the guide contains, in my mind, a very interesting case study that highlights on Haiti, which highlights to me a very important aspect, which is really that it's about individuals, and individual groups are about as important as what they're actually doing. So who does it is as important as what is done. And I just wanted to raise that because I think the study underlines this very much. Just after the earthquake in Haiti, I conducted a review of the social impact of emergency assistance. And I talked to a huge number of people across the board, both community leaders, international actors, professional associations, local government people, the president, the UN, various donors, etc., etc. So it was kind of a survey of different opinions. There were a number of emerging patterns and themes from this research that I think are applicable in other post-disaster and post-conflict contexts. And this is another issue I want to highlight here, that it's so important to cross-fertilize research findings across different contexts, especially regionally, but obviously also more disparately between Haiti, East Timor, and other places. But I think the regional aspect is extremely important. Just very briefly, maybe some helpful observations. There's sort of three key observations within the kind of do no harm framework that I think are possibly quite relevant to linking in research with operational humanitarian work. What I found in Haiti, actually in other places as well, that few, if any, systematic and effective processes exist by the multiple providers of aid, particularly emergency aid, to listen to and really hear how people on the receiving end of these efforts feel about them. I did find that the procedures and structures for international assistance bias the ways that agencies, staff, and even government agents listen and they do not listen, what they listen to, where and when they listen, and to whom they listen. And I think this is a very important cycle to break for research institutions when they're linking in with operational humanitarian groups. The second key aspect is about communication and consultation. It's an old chestnut, but actually it's not happening. And again, I think that linking in the research agenda with the operational humanitarian agenda could play a very important role in that way. In Haiti, for example, many of the communities and local authorities expressed frustration that they hadn't been consulted, and actually it was their country, it was about them, but the aid wasn't getting there or it wasn't particularly relevant. The key to me here is looking at different entry points. For example, in Haiti, there was a very obvious entry point, which was about the markets. The importance of markets in the social organization of Haiti are absolutely fundamental. We can argue about that if some Haiti experts are in the room. But this whole confluence of different issues of local, national, and international levels, which are interwoven with objects, money, and people, it's an important entry point. And I think, again, looking at entry points may be very important to bring those two issues together. The third observation is really, if you're going to measure social impact, it's a long-term process. You have to be anthropologically attuned to what is going on inside communities. Those working in agencies get caught up in processes, and I think those of you who are working in these know this very well, and you get very much involved in institutional priorities. You lose sight of actually what is going on in terms of the actual impact of what you're doing. So key for me really in all of this is that international approaches need to shift to being far more field-based and experience-driven rather than adopting a predominantly theory or model-based approach. And I really think this guide is quite an interesting starting point on this particular issue. Final example, very briefly, is about my experience when I was responding to sexual violence in DRC. Now, this is now an incredibly well-rehearsed topic, and it only took 5 years and 3 wars for international actors to think about actually focusing on this, and that was in 2006. But while I was working there, it became very clear to me that I needed more detailed analysis on the ability and also the failures of the international system to address sexual violence in DRC. There was a tendency to aim for simple soundbite solutions and completely ignore the complexity of available data, gaps in data, and gaps in knowledge, and how communities work on the ground. I mean, the example many of you know who worked in these places is that you have lots of celebrities coming in, they kind of decide they're going to adopt a course, and that's how it is. And then it becomes rather oversimplified. It happened, to my mind, in DRC when we were dealing with a woman called Eve Ensler, who started something called the V-Day campaign movement, turning very efficiently the media and donor spotlight on sexual violence in DRC. However, it totally lacked real data and an understanding of the community dynamics. It undermined, for many of us, the kind of ongoing efforts that we were involved in arranging mobile courts to bring perpetrators to account. And it also undermined the often important but underfunded localized efforts for medical and psychosocial support. And it even led, in some cases, to the stigmatization of abused women and girls. It's a longer issue, this, but I just wanted to raise that as a real caveat. So the point really is that money poured in without proper assessment on the ground of what the real needs and dynamics were. If I, at the time when I was trying to coordinate the programs and developing a strategy on sexual violence, had access to coherent data, access to research, and analytical capacity, I would have had real ammunition. The obstacle I faced in fulfilling my function are not uncommon in some of these high-profile field operations, but I lost valuable time by not having the right information. Another lesson that I learned is, well, other two lessons I learned are, the key point for me are partnerships with the use of national resources and national networks and national universities and some of the research that is ongoing there. And my final point is, which is also coming from my experience in DRC, is I think that many people have a fear of the complexity of the issue. We are all asked to go for quick wins when we're working on the ground. And the reality is that few amongst the agencies were prepared to accept the complexity of, for example, what sexual violence was about, and understand that it demands a daily engagement, high-level political support, constant updating and an analysis of data. So you need a longer-term analytical investment and a high degree of collaboration to achieve those. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry to cut you off. Nikki, that was fascinating, and you've painted a picture of yourself as someone I recognise, actually. Highly analytical, thoughtful about the work, hungry for research, anxious to have good data to inform decisions and to carry out monitoring and evaluation. Are you a typical practitioner in all those respects?
I'm not sure. I don't know what's typical in this kind of environment. You know, I think it takes all sorts to do this, and I think it depends at what stage you come into it. You know, I come to Haiti with a bit of a baggage in other places.
Let me put it another way. My guess is that you're rather unusual, actually, in being that thoughtful and analytical, and that an awful lot of practitioners don't even think about these questions, and that is one of the problems that researchers face. Is that true, or is that wildly insulting to the humanitarian practitioners?
I think the argument I was trying to make is that we need to get away from silos, and that we need to be very clear what we need and for what goal we're doing this, and be very practical and very practically oriented in that regard, and ask some very, very fundamental questions.